Welcome to the 11th CEPR-EAERE webinar on climate policies. My name is Christian Gaudier. I'm the director of that network, and I'm very happy to invite today three well-known, prominent contributors to public policies on climate change in the US. Joseph Aldi, Michael Greenstone, and Robert Stevens. Let me spend a minute to introduce my dear three panelists here. So Joseph Aldi is professor of economics at the Harvard University. In fact, at the Kennedy School, he is professor of the practice of public policies there. He is a university fellow at Resource for the Future, faculty research fellow at the NBR, and a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He is also the faculty chair for the regulatory policy program at the Mossavar Hamni Center for Business and Government. His research focuses on climate change policy, energy policies, and regulatory policy. The second panelist will be Michael Greenstone. Michael is the Milton Friedman Distinguished Service Professor in Economics, as well as the director of the Becker-Friedman Institute and the Interdisciplinary Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago. He previously served as the chief economist for President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, where he co-led the developments of the United States government's social cost of carbon. He is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a fellow of Economic Society, a Carnegie Fellow, and a former editor of the Journal of Political Economy. Finally, last but not least, we have Robert Stevens. Bob is the A.G. Meyer Professor of Energy and Economic Development, Director of Graduate Studies for the doctoral programs in public policy and in political economy and government. He is the director of the Harvard Environmental Economics Program and the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements. He is a research associate at the NBR, a university fellow of Resource for the Future, and former chair of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Environmental Economics Advisory Board. So thank you to all of you three to having accepted to participate to this webinar, where we will try to better understand from the other side of the Atlantic here in Europe the different determinants of the US climate policy situation. So with three specific issues, what's going on these days on the social cost of carbon in the public sector in the US. That will be a question that will be discussed by Michael Greenstone. There is an issue specifically on what will be and what will be the position and the status of the United States government in the international negotiation, in particular the link with the COP negotiation. I would like to hear here Bob Stevens discussing this issue. And eventually, last but not least here too, we all heard about this Inflation Reduction Act that has been passed through the Congress last summer. Europeans are particularly stressed by this new law in the US that provides support and subsidies and maybe protectionist position for the US institution to the energy transition, and I will ask Joseph Aldi to talk about what's going on there. So I ask the three panelists to make their presentation for a maximum duration of 20 minutes. That will leave open the discussion for the last 30 minutes after, what's your time, in 1 hour from now. So we will have a 30-minute discussion. Be prepared, prepare your question in the Q&A of this webinar. Thank you very much. So now, without any further details, let me give the floor to my first panelist, Joseph Aldi.
Thank you, Christian. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me pull up my slides for you. So in the United States, we've tried a number of approaches to how we would go about mitigating emissions. About 15 years ago, we started a rather intense debate in our Congress about whether we would have comprehensive economy-wide cap and trade legislation. As everyone knows, that did not succeed when it moved over to the US Senate. We then tried a period of time in which we were exploring various kinds of regulatory tools. We're still using some of these regulatory tools, but some of the most comprehensive and ambitious efforts have been thwarted through a rather long, complicated legal process. And so what we've seen in the past 2 years was an effort engaging both the White House and Congress, and at first the House, and then last year with the Senate, on how to use various kinds of subsidies to support the deployment of clean energy technologies. And so I'll focus here in my remarks opening up our session here today about how those subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act, the primary legislative tool, although not the only one, that will advance the deployment of clean energy technologies, how it's designed, what are its key objectives, and what I think are some of the key questions when we think about what impact it will have, as well as where I think some of our scholarship can actually help inform our understanding of this policy and hopefully build more effective climate policy down the line. So first, let me start with providing a bit of an overview of how the Inflation Reduction Act fits within current U.S. greenhouse gas emissions and the targets that this administration have set for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So we've seen really since about 2006, with some up and downs, a declining trajectory in U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of this has been occurring through the power sector, as we have significantly pushed out coal with a ramping up of natural gas and a ramping up of non-hydro renewables, primarily wind and solar technologies. We had, from back in 2009 and 2010, a pledge from the Obama administration to cut emissions 17% below the 2005 levels by 2020. That goal was met, but as everyone knows, because of the nature of the pandemic and the impact that had on the global economy, and certainly on the US economy, that last little bit to get to compliance with that may have been a function of truly what we hope is a unique year in terms of on many dimensions, including the US energy economy. The Obama administration pledged to continue emissions down to 26 to 28% below 2005 by 2025. The Biden administration has called for an acceleration of that to reduce emissions by at least half by 2030. That is in their nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement, and to achieve net zero emissions by the year 2050, a goal shared by the EU and many other nations now around the world. Now, to sort of put this in context, then, there are a number of policy objectives that I think that animate what the Biden administration wants to do and what the Biden administration in concert with Congress agreed to in the Inflation Reduction Act. So first, there's what we think of the primary policy objective of reducing emissions in line with these goals, but layered over that are a number of other policy objectives that help inform our understanding of how these policies were developed. So there's a kind of Buy American ethos that is common throughout the Inflation Reduction Act, and I'll go through some examples of that in a moment. We've seen this in various forms of previous legislation. The 2009 Recovery Act, the economic stimulus bill in response to the Great Recession, had some Buy American provisions as well. This is it takes several different forms in the Inflation Reduction Act, and as Christine noted at the top, has drawn the ire of some Europeans, but don't worry, the Europeans are not alone. It's drawn the ire of people from other parts of the world as well. There is the interest in supporting unionized labor, what we call within the U.S. the kind of Davis-Bacon Act that really calls on meeting the wages in your local market consistent with what are unionized wages, and have appropriate apprenticeship programs. And we'll see where some of the subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act are much more generous if you're able to meet these conditions that we typically associated with this part of U.S. law. Environmental justice is something that's come to the forefront in the Biden administration. They have announced at the beginning of the administration what they call the Justice 40 initiative, which called for at least 40% of the benefits of the clean energy transition accruing to disadvantaged communities, low-income communities, communities with high concentrations of people of color. And so this is something that also animates a lot of what the Biden administration is doing and how they will go about implementing provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. And then we have some of the sort of existing laws that place some constraints on how we build out our energy economy. And so a key one with that, but not alone, is NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, that does provide environmental reviews of any major energy infrastructure. NEPA, or some of the other acts that sometimes require reviews, are sometimes thought as slowing down some of our infrastructure investment. That may be a challenge when we think about the need to really accelerate investment in infrastructure if we're going to rapidly decline our emissions in the U.S. economy. But in a sense, you need to satisfy all these policy objectives if you're going to actually get to yes in the US Congress. And so to actually get a piece of legislation, a bill in Congress that can get a majority in both the House and the Senate, you need to be able to draw and satisfy each of these objectives. I'll also note, without getting into too much of the detail and the arcana of how the US Congress works, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed through something that we called budget reconciliation. That was the legislative vehicle. That actually enabled the Democrats in the Senate to pass this bill without any Republican support. Typically, a piece of legislation in the US Senate needs to have more votes, needs to have a supermajority of at least 60 of the 100 members to pass. But there's one kind of legislative vehicle that focuses on just taxes and spending. That's why there's nothing that's regulatory of nature in the Inflation Reduction Act. You can't actually use this legislative vehicle for that. So that's one reason why we have a bill that is primarily subsidies. There's some things that raise revenues. One minor provision that raises revenues in the clean energy space. Most of the other revenue raisers are more generally in the tax code and the reforms to the tax code made in this law. But it helps give a little bit of a sense of the institutional constraints that cause the focus here in this climate legislation to really be focused on climate subsidies. So when we think about the Inflation Reduction Act, it is, in terms of the estimated impact, is that it will result in either the outlay of spending or foregone revenues through tax expenditures of about $369 billion over 10 years. About 3/4 of this, about $270 billion, is through the tax code. Various kinds of tax credits. Again, the majority of these are going through the power sector. So it's for renewable power, for zero emission sources of power. So some of this could be for new nuclear, some of it supports existing nuclear, some of it could be for fossil with carbon capture and storage. There's about $35 billion of support for advanced fuels and electric vehicles, and about that same amount again for supporting residential homeowners and investing in energy efficiency, and in the manufacturing sector for their investments in clean energy. In addition to the tax expenditures, there's a number of different kinds of spending programs, whether it's for energy loan guarantees at the Department of Energy, whether it's a new spending program at EPA, which is intended to focus primarily on low-income communities, and also on very specific purposes, such as retrofitting diesel buses or trying to promote afforestation in our existing ag and forestry lands, and other smaller programs. So when you think about the Inflation Reduction Act and its impact in meeting our emission goals, one way to sort of think about this is sort of a, if you will, a kind of 20, 30, 40 metric. And by 20, 30, 40, I mean to say that right now, US emissions are about 20% below their 2005 levels. The sort of best estimates, if we sort of continue on current trends and with current policies, we're likely to get down to about 30% below our 2005 levels by the year 2030. If we were to, in implementing the Inflation Reduction Act, we're probably cutting our emissions down to about 40%. Now, there's certainly uncertainty here. I'm showing results from one modeling group, the Rhodium Group, that did a lot of sort of real-time analysis of policy proposals over the course of 2022. But having said that, there are other modeling teams that have produced similar kind of results. And so what that means is that we're going to continue to see a decline in US emissions. We're going to see that decline much faster over this decade because of the Inflation Reduction Act, but it's still not quite enough to get you to that 50 to 52% reduction that's called through in the nationally determined contribution that the Biden administration put forward under the Paris Agreement. So there's still more work that would need to be done, whether that's through new regulations under existing statutory authorities or potentially new actions by the states using their authorities or other legislation that might come down the line from the US Congress. Now, to sort of put this in context, I'd like to dig down a little bit on some of the design of the Inflation Reduction Act, think about these design issues and where there may be opportunities for research to better understand the impacts and inform how we might develop more effective climate policy down the line. First, I want to note that while there's this estimate that we're going to spend $369 billion over 10 years, and it's going to get us in that range of 40%, there's a lot of uncertainty in these outcomes. And it's important to sort of think about the sort of causes of the uncertainty. And part of it depends on which policy instrument we're using. So if we use appropriations, for example, so this is how much money we may give to the Department of Energy to spend on a program or how much we give to the Environmental Protection Agency to spend on a program. The upper bound on their spending is how much Congress has appropriated to them. Now, they could spend less than that, and we have examples of that in the past. The Department of Energy Loan Guarantee Program, and I'll show a figure in a moment on this, actually spent less than it was appropriated under the 2009 Recovery Act. Tax expenditures could be below or above our estimates of what they could be realized. Credit instruments could be below, could be above. It depends on what we're guaranteeing and how risky that is, and whether or not we're doing a good job as a government when we're actually subsidizing new investment through credit instruments, whether we're doing a good job of assessing ex ante what the realized risk and uncertainty will be for the payoffs from those investments. Now, there's a number of other factors that can influence the uncertainty in our outcomes. How executive agencies interpret the statutes. There's a lot of what the IRS is doing right now and in trying to interpret what are effectively new authorities under the tax code for supporting clean energy technology. It could be technological change. The lowering of costs of wind and solar enabled us to actually deploy a lot more through our tax credits over the past 15 years than we'd originally anticipated. And some of it may depend on the politics. In 2009 in the Recovery Act, we had a lot of money for high-speed rail. We don't have any high-speed rail yet in the United States. That was requiring partnerships between the federal and state governments, and a number of state governments decided they didn't want to be partners with the federal government on high-speed rail. So when we think about some of the lessons from the Recovery Act, this first figure here on the right is showing sort of what wind capacity, how many megawatts or how many gigawatts of wind we've installed each year from 2000 through almost the end of the past decade. The line on top is showing what our realized investment was. The dashed line on the bottom is what we had been forecasting right up until the point that we implemented the Recovery Act of 2009. So we saw a lot more investment of wind capacity come online. The economics just got a lot better for wind, and the generosity of the tax credits and some of the innovations in the 2009 law to make it easier to claim the tax credits really helped accelerate deployment of wind power. In contrast, the loan guarantee program, which had initially been appropriated $6 billion for credit subsidies to effectively, if you will, if you think about a loan guarantee as insurance, for the government to actually pay the premium on that insurance on a loan that a clean energy project might acquire. The Department of Energy Loan Guarantee Program actually spent a little bit less than a third of the monies that was appropriated before that program hit its legislative sunset, and the rest of the monies then went back to the general treasury. So there are a number of uncertainties that can influence in both directions how much deployment we get of clean energy. A clear element of this program is industrial policy. And we've heard a lot of discussion about this from the Biden administration. One way to sort of illustrate this is for the production tax credit for renewable power in the Inflation Reduction Act. If you're a new wind farm, and if your project satisfies wage and apprenticeship requirements, essentially consistent with what we see with union support, if you satisfy the requirement for domestic content, that a certain share of key components are manufactured in the United States, if you locate in a select identified energy community, which may reflect where we've historically had a lot of energy activity or fossil fuel activity, or a former brownfield community, or if you're in a low-income community, you would get about 3.4 cents a kilowatt hour. That's a large subsidy. So sort of the average wholesale price you might get for wind varies a lot across the US, but you might be seeing something in the market right now, maybe on the order of about 5 cents a kilowatt hour. So that's a big bump above what you would get in the wholesale market. Having said that, if you fail to meet each of those conditions, you'd only get about half a cent a kilowatt hour. So, you know, whether you're doing something that supports union jobs, if you have something that is consistent with Buy American, and something that's consistent with these kinds of place-based policies, you have a big increase. Unrelated to the emission impact, unrelated to the total amount of clean energy that's deployed, you'd have a big impact, though, in the level of the subsidy. And I think there's going to be a lot in trying to understand how effective are these policies in actually delivering on what are some of the objectives people have for industrial policy in terms of either regrowing certain parts of the United States where they've been in economic decline, and whether we're able to really grow out some of the kinds of jobs and some of the kinds of wages that advocates have pushed for. Now, we're doing something sort of new with our tax credits. We're establishing markets for tax credits. For the first time, a developer of, say, a tax credit eligible projects, say a wind farm, can now sell their tax credits to someone else. We also have something that's called a direct pay provision for a special class of developers. So if you were not eligible for a tax credit in the past because you're not a tax paying entity, maybe say a municipal government, for the first time, you can get something that is equivalent in value to the tax credit through this direct pay provision. So we have these new ways developers can get tax credits and monetize these tax credits. And that's intended to address what we think has been perhaps a limited supply of so-called tax equity. So historically, if I were a wind developer, the tax credits were valued a lot more than my tax liability. And as a result, I couldn't fully monetize those tax credits because I'm bounded by how much I pay the government in my taxes. We don't think on the business side of the tax code that we don't do refundability. So you can't have effectively a subsidy that exceeds your annual tax liability to the federal government. So in the past, a wind developer would partner with like a large financial, a big bank. The bank would have large taxable income, and they would provide equity to the project. And instead of getting paid out of revenues from selling wind power into the grid, they would actually get their payout from being able to claim the tax credits over time. But there's only so many partners who can do this. And in practice, they took a pretty big haircut. So about for every dollar of subsidy that was going out from the Treasury, about 85 cents of that was going to the renewable developer, and about 15 cents of that was going to a private bank. And so the intent here to make these transferable is to sort of circumvent that kind of constraint. This year, this market may be in excess of $10 billion. So we're going from 0 to 10 billion really fast. And I think there's some important questions about how well that market will function. What kind of information we need for that market to function well? Is there anything the government can do or anything that key stakeholders can do to produce that kind of information for a more efficient market? Any kind of institutional design that would make that market work more smoothly, so we don't let the financing through transferability serve as any kind of barrier to clean energy deployment. We're also seeing something kind of new in some of the elements of the Inflation Reduction Act towards a trend towards technology neutrality. Traditionally, our tax credits were very technology specific, but starting in 2025, the production tax credit, the PTC, the investment tax credit, the ITC will be emission based. We see a new subsidy for hydrogen fuels. The hydrogen production tax credit varies with the carbon intensity of production. We're seeing for oil and gas operations a methane fee that would effectively reflect the social cost of methane. We're also seeing for carbon capture and storage technologies, a tax credit that is valued at per ton of CO2 that is sequestered in the ground. And so I think part of it is worth exploring some of these instruments to get a sense of whether our subsidy design is better reflecting cost effectiveness that we might associate with carbon pricing. Are we getting closer to efficiency if some of these approaches to technology neutrality enable us to think about the subsidy being closer, say, to the social cost of greenhouse gases? It may also be worth thinking through how well these work in concert with regulations. The methane fee is going to be tied with what is a current proposed regulation on methane going forward. And so it'll be interesting to see how those two sort of interact and play out in the coming years. And then finally, I want to make a comment about performance evaluation. As I noted at the top, one of the key objectives for the Biden administration is to ensure that the benefits of the clean energy revolution are being shared, especially with historically disadvantaged communities through their Justice 40 initiative. The challenge is there's not much of the Inflation Reduction Act that specifically targets these communities. But having said that, there's a lot of investment that could occur that's spurred and subsidized by the Inflation Reduction Act that will deliver benefits for these communities. So even though a lot of the tax credits for renewables do not target these communities, to the extent that they're going to be displacing fossil fuel power generation, and we'll get less local air pollution if we're burning less coal for electricity in certain parts of the country, that's going to deliver benefits to some of these communities. And so I think it's going to be important for us to think about how we're going to design the programs, collect the data, and conduct ex post evaluation to be able to understand who's enjoying and sharing the benefits of the clean energy deployment that's supported through the Inflation Reduction Act. There's a lot of opportunity here, I think, for learning and for policy updating. Sometimes the bureaucracy in the federal government isn't that enthusiastic about this. Michael can speak about this some from, I think, his experience working at the Council of Economic Advisors and how he tried to push a sometimes reluctant bureaucracy in certain parts of the U.S. government in trying to design and implement their programs to enable credible evaluation of the causal impacts of the policy. But I think there are some new innovations in the federal policy in the United States, especially through the implementation of the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, what are now called learning agendas that every federal agency has now, where you can make a key part of what they're doing to try to implement this evidence-based approach to policymaking, make it a central part of how we learn how well our climate and clean energy agenda is being designed and implemented through the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's been a pleasure to join you here. I look forward to the comments from my fellow panelists, and I'm also excited about our discussion after the presentations. Thank you, Christian.
Thank you very much, Joseph. That's perfect in time and in quality of the of the content. So keep your question for the end of the three presentation. We will have 30 minutes discussion on these three panelist slides. So I directly go to the next panelist with Michael Greenstone, who will talk about the social cost of carbon. So Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's my great honor to be on a panel with Joe and Rob, and it's always a pleasure to see you, Christian, and I hope we see each other in person soon. It goes to everyone. So I'm going to try and cover the regulatory side of U.S. policy, and in particular, I'm going to focus on the social cost of carbon, which is a number I like to refer to as the most important number you've never heard of. And it is the damages associated with the release of an additional ton of CO2, and you could conversely think of that as the benefits from reducing CO2 by a ton. And the reason that that is so important is that it's a requirement that regulations that restrict CO2 emissions and that are federal regulations that restrict CO2 emissions tally up the costs and the benefits. And it's not that those are if the benefits exceed the costs, the rule is implemented like a robot, or that you're trying to maximize net benefits, but they're an important guidepost and help shape how stringent regulations are, at least in the U.S. government. So there's a long and windy history. Joe was involved in many parts of this. I think I will not bore everyone with every twist and turn, but I'll just note that in 2009, the kind of U.S. government, I think, kind of moved out of the darkness in the sense that there was this very, very odd thing where different agencies were valuing reductions in carbon in different ways. So you could think of an agency, let's call it the Department of Transportation, that might want more driving, thought that the social cost of carbon should be about zero, and the EPA, which thought that it should be less pollution, thought maybe it was infinite. And so in 2009, a group of us helped to suggest it and then helped to set the first U.S. government social cost of carbon, which was applied across the government. It was then updated in 2013 and expanded to include other greenhouse gases. In 2017, the National Academy of Sciences put out a report on exactly how it should be updated, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And that report was released the same week that President Trump was inaugurated, and I think it's maybe safe to say it did not receive a lot of attention from the U.S. government in the ensuing years. And in fact, the group that had been initiated social cost of carbon was disbanded in 2018. It was put back together in 2021. And then what I'm going to talk about is a recent EPA report from September that kind of shines a light on, it looks to me like where the U.S. government would like to go in terms of the value of the social cost of carbon. And if you wanted to be really concrete about it, at the end of the Obama administration, it was $52 per ton of CO2. During the Trump administration, it was somewhere between $1 and $8. And then when the Biden administration came into office, they immediately returned to the Obama number. And now what I'm going to talk about is this new number, which is about 4 times higher than the Biden administration number. And, just as, review, so why is the social cost of carbon so important? It's, as of 2017, it had been used to set more than 80 regulations with greater than $1 trillion of gross benefits. It was also used by the Trump administration to roll back a lot of environmental regulations. I think importantly, it has also stood as a centerpiece that other states, U.S. states and other countries have used as ways to kind of guide their thinking about how regulations should be thought of and the benefits of reducing CO2. Okay, so I'm going to give a little history of, the basis for all this is trying to understand what climate damages are. And I'm going to give a little very, very brief history of that, and then talk about this new era that we're in. And the EPA seems to be drawing from this new body of research that has really developed over the last 10 or 15 years. So the history, as many people on this call, Zoom, are familiar with, is really comes from Bill Nordhaus's path-breaking work, for which he won the Nobel Prize. He developed the DICE integrated assessment model, and there were two other models that were very closely related, the Page model and the Fund model. And here it's just kind of telling you at the end of the century, according to those models, what would be if temperature change were on the horizontal axis, what would be the loss of global GDP. The challenge, let's see if I can move the slides. The challenge, there are a couple challenges with the original IAM approach. The first was there just wasn't a lot of geographic resolution. And so in the case of the United States, which I know much better than Europe, it was kind of like saying Miami, which is surely going to be flooded to no end, was the impact of climate change would be the same as in Minnesota or some northern part of the United States, where honestly getting rid of very cold winters, probably the benefits would be quite, or will be quite substantial. And so a lot of the geographical resolution was lost. And a challenge with that, or wasn't available. A challenge with that is, like, I think people had a hard time connecting to it. They don't want to know what the global mean is or the mean across 12 regions of the world. They kind of want to know what the impacts are going to be where they happen to live. A second challenge with the IAM work is that when Bill and others built these IAMs, you know, it was kind of in a period before it's not like there weren't computers, but the computers were terrible. And it was also where there wasn't lots of data available. And so they did like totally sensible things. They made assumptions about what the relationship was between damages and temperature change, and, you know, argued about, was it quadratic or cubic or something like that. And you can see here all the papers that they relied on were kind of from the mid-90s or early 2000s. And what that missed was this explosion of research that has gone on in the last 10 or 15 years. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is there was a great opportunity to improve our understanding or take advantage of advances in research. And the $51 per ton number was kind of stuck using those IAMs. The National Academy of Sciences outlined how to make advances on the climate models, on discounting, on damages, and a couple groups, when in the face of the Trump administration's kind of ignoring of the National Academy of Sciences, a couple groups got together on their own and kind of took up the mantle. RFF has done some very, very important work, especially focused on discounting, and the Climate Impact Lab, which I helped form with three friends and colleagues, Trevor Hauser, Solomon Shung, and Bob Kopp, emphasized damage estimation and kind of building a new holistic model. And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit here for a few minutes. And so this Climate Impact was a collaboration between the University of Chicago, where I teach, Berkeley, the Rhodium Group, and Rutgers, reflecting each of our affiliations. Okay, so we said for ourselves, you know, this is a little bit like, I don't know if this phrase works in Europe, but like in the US, everybody loves apple pie. And then I'm sure this is also true in Europe, everybody loves their mother. And so we set like a couple criteria that were meant to be non-controversial and kind of in the spirit of you should love your mother and you should love apple pie. And you should have the best available empirical evidence, the best available climate models. The data should be globally representative. The estimate should account for adaptation and its costs, and the approach should value uncertainty and unequal impacts. So the way we went about doing that is kind of sector by sector, and then pulling it all together. And at this point, we've done 5 sectors. We're working on several more, but there are 5 completed ones that will feed into this $190 number. The first is the mortality sector. What will changes in temperatures do? The second is agriculture, energy consumption, labor supply, and coastal damages. And then we're later this year, probably in the summer, we're going to release what we're calling an integration paper that kind of pulls us all together. And I'm going to cheat and show you guys some of the results of that today. Okay, one thing that we thought was an attribute is we were able to get really fine-grained geographic resolution using this approach. And rather than relying on the 12 regions that the Rice model had used, we were able to provide estimates for 25,000 separate regions around the world. We try to match them to political jurisdictions. So in the US case, it's counties, in India, it's districts, and I think it varies a little bit across European countries. Let me give you a flavor. So each of these 6 maps are damages associated in the red box here for mortality, electricity, other fuels, labor supply, agriculture. So in general, blue is going to be benefits from a warming climate, and you can see that those are going to be concentrated in the northern reaches of the planet, and red will be where there's damages. And so I'm going to just dive into the mortality work. This was published last year in the QJE. And, you know, a key first step was to just get data from as many parts of the world as possible. And I'll just spoil the punchline here. What we're going to find is very substantial mortality impacts of climate change. And that stands in contrast to what had previously been known. And and previously it kind of looked like it would be zero, where people thought the decrease in very cold days would be counterbalanced almost perfectly by the increase in very hot days. And the problem was all the data that people had been using, which was the only data that was available, tended to be from kind of rich, very temperate places like the US or Northern Europe. And so once you start to get data from the whole world, the picture changes quite dramatically. And I'll try and talk about that. So here is what we refer to as a response function. This is on the horizontal axis, daily temperature, and on the y-axis, we have deaths per 100,000, and this is our estimating equation. And I'm just going to show you, we're going to do this for separate age categories, and this is using this data from around the world. So for less than 5, we basically find no relationship between temperature and mortality. For 5 to 64, we find very little relationship as well. And then we find this very sharp U relationship for people over 65. And you can see very cold days and very hot days are quite dangerous and lead to high rates of mortality. So this will be that underlying relationship that drives the results that I'm going to show you. What was also interesting that came out of the data are that U relationship for over 65 is deeply or strongly modified by 2 factors. The first is your underlying climate. So if it's a hot place, and I'm going to show you, you know, if it's a hot place that you live in or a cold place, and then also by income. And so let's just take a look at this. So here's the relationship for people over 60. When a hot day arrives that's greater than 35, that's the mean daily temperature relative to 20 degrees C. And you can see there's a very sharp relationship in these red places in the world, the very cold places. That is, lots of people die when a hot day arrives in one of these places. They come very rarely, but when they do. Now and that's the coldest decile. Now I'm going to move down deciles. So here's the 9th decile, the 8th decile, the 7th decile, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And what I want you to take away from that is there's lots of adaptation happening in the world. When, you know, in the US, you would call this something like Houston. When hot temperatures come to Houston, they're much less deadly than when they come to, say, Seattle in the United States, which doesn't get hot days very often. And that's reflective of adaptation. And so we're going to account for that as well as the cost of those adaptations in our overall estimates. When you pull it all together, this is kind of what comes out. There's really remarkable heterogeneity around the world. This is the full mortality risk at the end of the century from climate change. And you can see how unequally it's distributed around the world. So Oslo here is a really good example. Cold winters are terrible in Norway. And so there's going to be a very large reduction in mortality there. And Oslo is also rich. In Accra, which is a poor and hot place, conversely, you'll have this very large increase in mortality. And I think this emphasizes, you know, what climate change is going to be like depends on where you are. When you pull this all together, if you had a model that didn't account for adaptation, you would overstate the damages by about 63%, or the damages are 63% lower if you allow for income and climate adaptation. And these are our overall results on change in deaths per 100,000 by the end of the century. And you can just see adaptation makes a big difference. Okay. We also look at fuel use and electricity and published a paper in Nature about electricity. I'm not going to go into that in as much depth, but there's a couple things I just want to point to. First, there was much better data available for the whole world, practically the whole world for electricity collected by the IEA. But here, what really popped out of the data was how different the relationship is depending on how wealthy the country is. And so this is a U relationship between temperature and electricity consumption. So on very cold days and very hot days, people use a lot more electricity. This is in the richest decile places in the world. Now I'm just going to move across deciles. And so here I'm going to introduce 9, 8, 7 deciles. And what's should be shocking to you is how quickly that U relationship starts to disappear. And so by the time you're in the 7th decile, there's almost no relationship between daily temperature and consumption and electricity consumption. With that, the data is trying to tell you is, and I'll go to the other deciles here, is like, until you're in about the 8th decile, you're not wealthy enough to be able to respond with cooling and heating in ways that we take for granted in the wealthy countries that a lot of people on this Zoom call are in. And so that was a really striking finding, because previously all the data we had was from rich countries, and we kind of thought that there was a U around the world. Okay, and here's how electricity consumption is projected to change by the end of the century. I need to speed up a little bit. I'm going to pull this together here and show you our whole 5 sectors damages at the end of the century expressed as a percentage of local GDP per capita. And, you know, one thing I want you to take away is like the damages in electricity or in labor supply are not exactly geographically perfectly correlated with the ones in mortality. And so you kind of have to add it up and get to get the full picture. And again, what's leaps across from my eyes is like, you know, if we didn't have things that we called borders, you know, the obvious solution to climate change is to take all these billions of people who live in these places that are kind of at the center of the hurricane of climate change and have them move to the blue areas. That would happen. Of course, free migration is not something that the world seems especially excited about. And so we're going to have to be dealing with these challenges with borders as a huge constraint. A couple other things I just want to highlight. There's a lot of uncertainty in our estimates and anyone's estimates of climate change. You know, trying to predict what's going to happen at the end of the century is a challenge, no doubt. Some of that uncertainty comes from the climate models, and here I'm trying to represent it with the red and blue distributions. Some of it comes from those estimates that I was showing you of mortality impacts. Those are all estimated with uncertainty. Other sources of uncertainty come from what you assume about emissions and socioeconomic scenarios. RFF has done some very important work on that using expert elicitation. And it's going to be important to, all I want to say is it's going to be important to account for that uncertainty in developing an overall estimate. So if you put it all together, this is a total walk's favorite set of figures, at least if you're obsessed with the social cost of carbon like I am. You can explain the social cost of carbon in 4 panels. Here is your shooting up of an extra plus of CO2 into the atmosphere. Oh no. Okay, there we go. This is what happens to CO2 concentrations going out to 2300. It goes up immediately. Then as the oceans start to absorb it, it starts to go down. And by 2300, it is still having an impact because the oceans are starting to release some of it while what's in the atmosphere starts to degrade. Then you can ask, well, what's going to happen to temperatures? Here's the impact from that extra pulse of CO2 on temperatures out to 2300, again, with some air bands around it. And here, using our approach, here's what the damages year by year are from an additional ton of CO2. And so you can see the ton of CO2 you shot up today is still causing, this is undiscounted, still causing problems as late as 2300. Okay, so let's just pull it all together. This is just a little chart. Our model is called DSIM. It's a terrible name, but we couldn't think of we could only think of more terrible ones, and some differences with the IAMs. I want to emphasize we do not have all sectors. At this point, we only have 5, so you should think of this as an underestimate. And we don't have these kinds of sectoral interactions. So if you think big damages in India are going to lead to conflict with Pakistan or someone else, that's outside of what we've done. When you put it all together, we end up with a number of about $190. Again, that's almost 4 times larger than the U.S. government had used previously based on the IAMs. You can do all kinds of fun things then once with our geographic resolution and these estimates. One thing I did is I divided the world into the OECD. Low income is defined as people living, it's a World Bank definition, I think less than $3 a day. So that's about 700 million people, and then the kind of middle of the world. And you can ask, well, of that $189, how is that distributed around the world? Well, it turns out the OECD actually benefits, this is from an additional ton of CO2, about $11, and about $200 of damages are spread around the world. It does not take a political scientist to understand the complications of that for reaching international agreements. A different way to examine this is to look at damages at the end of the century as a percentage of the region's 2099 GDP. And here you can see again how unequal the damages are going to be distributed. In OECD, the damages will be about 1.5% of GDP, according to our estimates, 8% in that today's middle income countries, and about 12% of GDP in today's poor countries. Okay, you can also do all kinds of other funds and games once you have the social cost of carbon. You could just multiply the social cost of carbon by today's global emissions. I would argue that really is marginal relative to what's in the atmosphere. We're doing about $7 trillion worth of damages a year. The world is based on its emissions. And so in principle, in some kind of green GDP accounting sense, you could shave that off of growth. And I'll just close with, why is it so valuable? Or let me phrase that a different way. What are the implications of a higher social cost of carbon? Well, in the previous one, these are a bunch of different policies that the U.S. had. Most of those policies didn't look like such a hot idea. It looked like the costs exceeded the benefits. With a higher number, you can see many of the policies that the U.S. or states have pursued in the United States now have kind of moved into the green. And so let me close with that and just say how excited I am to hear what Rob has to say next. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. Very nice. Let me directly go to Rob's presentation because we are a little bit late. Thank you.
In order to leave time for questions, I think I'm going to eliminate some of my slides to make my presentation briefer. So what I'm talking about, as you can see, is trying to place what's happening in the United States into the global context, in particular with regards to the negotiations of the UNFCCC and the annual conferences of the parties. Of the 180 people who are watching this, I have no idea how many of you are familiar with the international climate negotiations. So I'll just say very briefly, it started in Rio de Janeiro when the Framework Convention was itself agreed to. That was in 1992. And then since then, starting in Berlin in 1995, there have been annual conferences of the parties of the agreement. So COP1 was in Berlin, COP3 was in Kyoto, Japan in 1997. That was when the Kyoto Protocol was agreed to. Fast forward to Paris, 2015, COP21. That was, of course, the Paris Agreement. And then just a few months ago in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, was COP27 in November of 2022. And that's what I'm largely going to talk about. What I want to say before I get into talking about Sharm el-Sheikh is that there has been an evolution over time in the negotiations. The first one I went to, which was actually with Joe Aldi in Bali, Indonesia, COP13 in 2007. And there was something very important that happened over time, and that is the original Framework Convention provides a role for quote unquote civil society to participate. That doesn't mean that they're voting members in the negotiations for an agreement, but that they're invited. And in other words, NGOs of all kinds, trade associations, universities, on and on. And back in 2007, I would say that 95% of the meaningful action was taking place within the negotiations themselves. And then 5% were these civil society sideshows, including our own. But there's been a gradual evolution of that over time until we've gotten to the point that I would characterize, and not pejoratively, but I would characterize Sharm el-Sheikh as Climate Expo 2022. So it has become a climate expo. At best, it's become something like Davos, but for climate change. And now what's happened is that we have this three-ring circus, and any year, 5% to 25% of what's meaningful are in the negotiations among the parties, the countries, governments, and 75% to 95% of what's significant, meaningful, is among the civil society sideshows, the private sector, NGOs, and governments. And in saying this, again, I want to emphasize, I don't mean it to be necessarily pejorative, because what takes place can be meaningful. And I think we're going to see that a bit here. So with that, I really want to go right to Sharm el-Sheikh. I'm going to skip some background, also skip the Paris Agreement, and go right to what happened in Sharm el-Sheikh. To me, it's quite interesting that the most important development during COP27 occurred 6,000 miles away in Bali, Indonesia, when President Joe Biden and China President Xi Jinping met on the sidelines of the G20 summit. And they didn't just shake hands for the photographers, but they held a 3-hour meeting discussing a lot of topics, including climate change. Now, that's important because, of course, during the Trump years with America First policy, there was the beginnings of a great deal of protectionism and also hostility towards China. Alas, America First evolved in the Biden administration to American manufacturing first. And in addition to that, is the reality that in the United States, there is bipartisan support for very few issues, but one in the Congress for which there's bipartisan support is economic protectionism. And it's for a variety of reasons that the Republican Party, which was historically free trade, has become quite protectionist. The Democratic Party, which has moved further left to its progressive, quote, fringe, that series of progressives are themselves, it turns out, protectionist. So there is bipartisan support. In addition to that, there is bipartisan support for China bashing. And some of that is for good reasons or not. There are a variety of issues which have nothing to do with climate change, which have to do so with international trade, with concerns about human rights in China, with democracy, lack of democracy in Hong Kong, with threats of Taiwan, on and on. And for all of those reasons, we've seen a situation in which the co-leadership of the United States and China during the Obama administration, which is what led to the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement would not have taken place had it not been for the co-leadership of China and the United States. I can defend these claims if anyone cares in Q&A. So then there was the shaking hands and a conversation that took place in Bali. Well, it did immediately trickle down. I was talking with the negotiating teams from many countries, including certainly the EU negotiators in the US, and the signal trickled down to John Kerry and Xi Jinping, the head of the two negotiating teams. And so it appeared at the time that there might even be a return to the co-leadership that had been so instrumental for the enactment of the Paris Agreement in the first place. But now I think we have to acknowledge, or at least I'll acknowledge, that ongoing political developments, including balloons floating over the United States, but also all the ongoing protectionism and national security concerns in the South China Sea may well overwhelm that. So it's really too soon to say. So let me leave Bali, Indonesia, and go back to Egypt. And what was interesting or important that happened there? Well, the most contentious and most dramatic decision at COP27 had to do with a fund for so-called loss and damage. So for those of you who are not aficionados, may I explain? The Paris Agreement itself, as was the Kyoto Protocol, is largely about emissions reductions via these nationally determined contributions. Aldi mentioned that the US is 50 to 52% by 2030 relative to 2005, which is actually quite ambitious for the United States. But that's all about emissions reductions, mitigation. There are also some elements in the Paris Agreement that really address adaptation. At least some countries think they address adaptation. That includes this $100 billion fund, which isn't fully funded, that gets a lot of talk. But adaptation is not possible for some impacts, the poster child being the existential impacts on small island states, but also drought in sub-Saharan Africa, probably. And so the notion is that there's still another element, and that's what, when they refer to loss and damage, that's what it's referring to. The third one, for things that are not addressed by mitigation, since climate change will happen anyway, and can't be addressed by adaptation. Now, this has actually been quite controversial. Going back, it's now been on the table for about 8-9 years, and it's always been controversial because there's a bimodal distribution of views. On the one hand, you have the most vulnerable countries in the world for whom this is absolutely essential to consider this, and you can see why. On the other hand, it's been unacceptable to include seriously by the major contributors to the stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, because they were worried that, or are worried, that this is going to be a prescription for international legal liability for bad weather. After all, we can never say, except with awaiting by some probability, whether or not the latest typhoon in the Philippines, or actually the one currently in New Zealand, is periodic bad weather, or whether it is a consequence of climate change. So they're very worried about international legal liability. Now, this was finessed in the Paris Agreement, and you could be cynical about this or admire it as you choose. Article 8 of the Paris Agreement essentially says loss and damage is a very important issue, but then Decision 52, which accompanies the Paris Agreement, has in it that the parties, in other words, all the parties, 195 of them, agree that it does not provide a basis for any liability or compensation. So you can understand that the most vulnerable countries of the world were not particularly satisfied with the outcome of the Paris Agreement, and it's been bubbling up and bubbling up. And I predicted it about a year and a half ago that it would be the top issue at the COP this year, or this past year in Sharm el-Sheikh, which it turned out to be. What happened was that even though the US for years, whenever there was talk about creating a fund for loss and damage, the US was very strongly opposed to it. So were China and the European Union, the major contributors to the stock, for the reasons I said before. And on the demand side, a fund could eventually add up to trillions of dollars. That's on the demand side. I'm thinking that the World Bank estimated that the 2022 Pakistani floods cost $40 billion in damages. So eventually, globally, with damages getting worse, you could see what would happen. But on the supply side, although there have been some quantitative pledges, they're in the tens of millions of dollars and naturally come from European countries. So then the question comes up, is this new loss and damage fund just an empty shell? Now, China has verbally supported the creation of a fund, but they say that as a developing country, they won't contribute to the fund. Their position, of course, is linked to the 1992 list of non-Annex I countries when China's per capita GDP was less than $400 per year. Of course, since then it's grown by 3,300%, but China retains its claim to being a developing country, so they won't contribute to it. Now, the US story winds up in a similar place, and this is my language. It's not an official pronouncement from the US government, but my language is that the US view is that we, the US government, support the loss and damage fund. After all, they did, Kerry changed his views and the US voted for it. But due to a Republican majority in the House of Representatives, it is simply impossible for us to make any commitments of new funding. In other words, China and the US wind up in the same place. Loss and damage is important. The loss and damage fund is important. We support it, but no, we're not giving any money to it. So that takes me back to the question, is the loss and damage fund an empty shell? Or you could ask, is it a principled first step toward an equitable allocation of responsibility under the Paris Agreement? And I guess I would suggest that it's really some of both. How it evolve over time, whether it'll go all one or all the other, I don't know. Now, there were other developments and issues at COP27. I think I'm just going to mention two of them. One is that if you read the press, the hand-wringing was about that the closing statement didn't fully embrace the 1.5 degrees C target. It's a bit valid concern, but what I reflect on, having been involved in this for quite a while, is that the pre-Paris IPCC predicted 7 degrees C global warming this century, with the original Paris nationally determined contributions, if they were complied with, down to 3 degrees C. Add in the enhanced NDCs, including the US, again, if complied with, and the Kigali amendments on CFC to the Montreal Protocol, then we're down to 2.5. So the process is a marathon, not a sprint, and it's really impossible to assess an individual conference of the parties numerically in terms of adding up the targets as if that was the end of the story. It's not. It's an ongoing process. The other thing that's very important that I really work on and have done research and written about ad nauseum for quite a few years is Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. What this refers to is that individual parties can put in place domestic policies, and then they can link their policies. So, for example, as California and Quebec have linked their cap and trade systems, as the EU and Switzerland have linked their cap and trade systems. But linkage doesn't have to be just between cap and trade systems. It can be between cap and trade systems, carbon taxes, and performance standards. And by doing that, you bring down costs. And that's important because bringing down costs can, of course, facilitate a greater ambition. But the linkage then allows for the trading, but the trading would be between companies, firms in different jurisdictions, or the same company within two jurisdictions. But then that brings up a question: how will that be quantified when the parties are looking at compliance with an individual NDC? Is there going to be double counting? And Article 6.2 is essentially an accounting mechanism in the Paris Agreement that can facilitate linkage and therefore lower costs. So it's the key economic article or sub-article of the entire Paris Agreement. Unfortunately, recent developments cause concern, at least to me, that some countries, some parties are interpreting Article 6.2 to be like the Kyoto Protocol's Article 17, which, gosh, 20 years ago I wrote about with Bob Hahn why it was never going to accomplish anything. And it may go in the same direction. So finally, what to expect at next year's COP28 in Dubai. And the only reason you should listen to what I'm saying about what to expect next year is that it turned out I was right about a year and a half ago about what to expect would happen in Sharm el-Sheikh. So COP27 Sharm el-Sheikh, that was officially the implementation COP. And next year's COP28 in Dubai, United Arab Emirates, is officially the global stocktake COP. We could talk about that. But if COP27 was in effect, turned out to be the loss and damage COP, which it was, then I would suggest we might expect that because of the incoming UAE presidency of COP28, not just the fact that it's the UAE, but also the specific presidency, will make it the carbon removal COP with much renewed attention, at least in terms of the UNFCCC, to carbon capture and storage, carbon capture and utilization, direct carbon removal, and even solar radiation management. Now, if that happens, it is going to be controversial, like loss and damage was this year, but of course, for different reason and with very different parties on the two sides of it. So I think I'm going to stop with that and turn it back to you, Christian.
Wow, thank you very much, Rob. Well, this was a very intense and rich set of contribution to the debate. Thank you so much. I think I better understand the current situation in the US. I have several questions, and I will complement this question with those who are currently on the Q&A. So let me first start with Rob, as it's still hot in my mind. What do you mean by this Article 17 in Kyoto being something bad and probably destroying value? And could you tell us more about that? You didn't mention the possibility to move from a COP system where you need unanimity to an alternative system where some countries would decide to do some side negotiation and compromise and coalition, like a climate club idea. So let me start with these two questions, Rob.
So, Christian, first of all, I would have been very disappointed if you didn't raise the prospect of climate clubs as an alternative to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. When you introduced me when I spoke in Paris, which is maybe 10 years ago, you and others in the audience went off on that. And so I'm pleased that you've retained your interest. There has been slightly increasing interest over time from the academic community, first from a variety of people. And then, of course, when Bill Nordhaus gave attention to it, the prominence of that academic attention shot up. But also importantly, there's been increased attention, particularly from Germany, so from some political leaders. What's important is that in the foreign ministries around the world, the notion is somewhat frightening, and they're not supportive of it. What I would say is that it is conceivable that the European CBAM, to be implemented, I guess, the beginning of 2026, together with some sort of a strange US CBAM without a domestic carbon price, that those two countries may be able to join forces to bash China, which would be politically attractive, possibly in both regions. And that might be the beginning of a productive climate club with probably the other industrialized countries, joining in. So Japan, New Zealand, Australia, we would see, and Canada join into that. That notion is extremely negatively perceived by 150 countries in the world, namely the developing countries. They view it as it's just going to be something to screw them. And that's the purpose, of course, is to screw them, to convince them to take domestic action to join. But it's possible. That was my positive take on it, that it's possible it will evolve into an effective climate club. It's also possible that what's going to come from the CBAM and U.S. Action is increasing environmental protectionism. And even if the WTO is not on the path to collapse already, it may push it in that direction. So I think that's an open question. Article 7.
We should pursue on this specific debate on the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, protectionism, international negotiation, and CBAM in Europe. I mean, and I would like also to hear Joe on this issue, and maybe Michael too. I mean, what do you? And let me maybe focus on Europe versus the US. I mean, how can we see the instant implementation of CBAM in Europe as a way to go against the US with their subsidies, and how the CBAM will take into account subsidies in the US, where some industries will start decarbonizing their production, export their production in greener production to Europe, and Europe imposing carbon border adjustment to this production. How can I mean, I don't see how can that work, and how the US will perceive this CBAM from the European allied countries. So maybe Joe.
So I think US-Europe, it's a complicated relationship now. I mean, one way to think about this is you had the announcement in 2021 of the CBAM under the ETS, and then we had in the run-up to the Glasgow COP this agreement on aluminum and steel between the US and the EU. And so you can see where the Europeans are sort of forcing the issue, and where there's ways to try to think about perhaps cooperation, so that we don't get to the point of starting to penalize imports for their carbon content among the US and EU. But having said that, there's certainly a lot that we've heard about frustrations with the United States, with the significant focus on domestic manufacturing and domestic content, whether it is in the power sector. A lot of it has to do as well with electric vehicles and the batteries going into electric vehicles, and sort of, there are some countries, sometimes the term gets used in US debates now of friend shoring. So even if we don't bring back, so for those jobs and activities that have since been outshored, some of them you want to bring back to the US, but some of them you bring back, in a sense, to your friends, defined by who we have free trade agreements with, or defined by having the trade agreement we have with the US and with Canada and Mexico. So I think there's part of that creates tensions, obviously, with the Europeans. Do the Europeans go the route then of saying, okay, we're going to subsidize a bunch of our technologies? I suppose they could, but a lot of European governments have been dealing with the shock of trying to keep energy prices low in response to the Russian war in Ukraine. I think the window for the US of having a big subsidy program was last year. When we just think about the cost of borrowing now have increased a lot, I just don't think there would be appetite here in the US, and I'm not sure there's appetite as given that the same kind of interest rate environment characterizes the borrowing opportunities for a lot of European governments as well.
But the CBAM, suppose that we succeed in Europe to impose CBAM, in particular for the import from the US. Don't you think that it would be an argument for the Republicans to accept a carbon tax or a carbon pricing mechanism like a market for permit? Michael, maybe you want to contribute to this debate.
I think that's optimistic. I think that's an argument for the Republicans for a trade war.
Okay,
I mean, there are some who want to do a US CBAM without domestic regulation or a domestic carbon price.
No, that's not possible. You cannot have a CBAM without an internal carbon price.
So, Christian, you're presenting a challenge to U.S. legislators, and I think the ability of the U.S. Congress to craft laws inconsistent with the WTO is something they're capable of.
Okay, well, we are not in a good situation in our relationship between the US and Europe these days. So Michael, maybe let us spend a few minutes on your social cost of carbon at $189 per ton of CO2. There are questions by Adrien Fabre on the chat about how do you get there? Not only, I mean, I see that you get special damages, mortality and things like that, but what about the discount rate and it's a shock from the European point of view, and probably for most of my colleagues in the US, that we move from a carbon value of around $50 to something close to $200. Is, of course, a radical transformation. So there is a question there about how do you get this big jump in the carbon value. Also, I would like to ask you a question about how do we reconcile on one side this in the past relatively low value of carbon in the US with the relatively large ambition of the US to reduce emission by 50% by the year 2030. Do you think that this carbon value is large enough to lead this energy transition within the next 7 years to get to this target of minus 50% emission?
Yeah, so I guess on the first question, how do we get all the way to $190 from $51? And the truth is, many things changed, and so it's hard to isolate exactly the one factor. But one is, which I was emphasizing, is the damage functions. We now have much more robust and much more data-driven damage functions, and so that is one important change. Another important change was moving to kind of a Ramsey-style discounting, and that played a big role. And related to that was bringing in and really accounting for the sources of uncertainty. And so that when you have bad states of the world, those get discounted differently than when you have good states of the world. And then there was also some important changes in terms of updating the climate models. And so really what you had is that the IAMs, or the $50 number, were kind of just based on data science and economics. And together, all these changes have led to this much larger number. And I want to emphasize that there are no doubt important features of the damages that are missing from those estimates, which are other sectors, and then the interaction between the sectors that I was talking about. Then I think you also asked, can this play an important role in getting to 50% reduction in 2030? And I absolutely think that there are large sectors that are kind of untouched by the IRA, and they're really the main route to gaining any traction there is going to be through the regulatory route. And then the social cost of carbon is, the straw that stirs the drink with respect to the regulatory route. And whether or not that will exactly get to 50% reduction, I don't know. Maybe this is slightly heretical in Europe, but I'm very much I'm less hung up on particular percentage reductions by particular years, and much more focused on thinking, to be really simple, every ton matters. And so having, and the social cost of carbon tells you how much each ton matters. And so having this higher cost of social cost of carbon is going to facilitate much larger reductions through the regulatory channel. And then the role that the U.S. government social cost of carbon is kind of serving as a focal point for other governments and for other organizations, I think will kind of have knock-on effects.
But Michael, could you clarify one point here? This $190 per ton of CO2 of the EPA report you mentioned, published last September, is it now the official number, or what's the status?
No. So what the EPA did was bring it in it's the first time they've surfaced it. It was used in regulatory analysis for a particular regulation. They're seeking public comment on it. They have also appointed a group of experts to judge what went into it. And then based on that public comment, which I think is closing in maybe today or tomorrow, they and their set of experts will make some ultimate judgment on is this.
And what's the link with the inter-agency working group? I mean, is it something different from that dynamics?
Yeah, so I think to understand all of it, you'd have to have the inner workings of the Biden administration. I do note that it is a departure from using the interagency working group. Having said that, and Joe will know this very well, as additionally, there's basically one agency in the U.S. government that has the technical expertise to say anything consequential about the social cost of carbon. And if I were in a different agency that had authority over rules in some other area, I would be extraordinarily reluctant to go against what the EPA did. And of course, the White House kind of centralizes regulations at the end. So my expectation is that were the EPA to officially adopt it, it would kind of become a replacement. But, I would call that speculation from an outsider who once was an insider.
Okay, so thank you very much. So let me also mention that in Europe for a long time, I was very pessimistic about the possibility to have a carbon price covering all sectors. And you probably know that currently the situation in Brussels that we may have a second ETS market covering mobility and residential sectors. So that at the end of the day, in the European Union, we will have a carbon pricing covering everything, and complemented with the CBAM. I mean, it's quite of a complete framework for carbon pricing in Europe. So could it be possible that one day this 190 euros, the carbon value, could be translated in a carbon price or carbon tax in the US? I understand that Joe is very pessimistic about that. What's your position, Mike?
So let me just say, I have found, I was surprised once the US government set the social cost of carbon now 10 or 12 years ago, how focal that became. And then what you began to see were bills in Congress for carbon pricing of various things. And if you could just imagine, there's like a 28-year-old staffer who doesn't know anything really about this, and they're searching for something and they want something credible. And, oh, well, the US government has social cost of carbon number. Why not start there?
Okay, let us see. Let us wait for that's happening.
Maybe that's too optimistic, but it's kind of my view. Yeah.
Okay. So let us go back to this subsidy war. There is, by the way, there are several questions on the Q&A. If some of you, the panelists, want to contribute answering those questions, because I don't think we will be able to cover everything. There is a specific question on subsidy war. What's the risk? Seeing from this initiative of the US to implement this Inflation Reduction Act, where you have a form of protectionism because you need a share of domestic product in the system in order to get the subsidy. What's the risk to see, in fact, a lose-lose solution where we will start entering into a subsidy war, and we see Europe starting to think about that?
Well, it's already started. I mean, the European Commission has its proposal for reducing limits on state aid. In other words, for countries to subsidize their domestic manufacturing, which, of course, the European Union was partly founded to prevent such things as happening. Now, Germany and France, not surprisingly, are quite supportive of this. They think it's a dandy idea. Not so much Southern Europe, not so much far Northern Europe, but the two powerhouses are supportive. So as far as I'm concerned, what could turn out to be unfortunate trade war of protectionism between the two countries, fueled partly by both by the CBAM and by the Biden administration's
the
domestic
CBAM
content.
is not protectionist. CBAM is just putting the same price to all producers willing to sell product on the European soil. So I would completely disagree to put on the same floor the subsidies condition on the domestic share of the product and the CBAM. I mean,
Well, but maybe not in the pejorative sense of protectionism. The purpose of the CBAM, as I think you know, Christian, it was not invented by the European Commission policy wonks. It was invented by the lobbyists from private industry in Brussels, who was worried about their competitive disadvantage vis-a-vis the United States, China, and countries. They're the ones who wanted it.
No, because they are losing their free allowances. So they lobbies are not happy.
They're the ones who wanted it, and they got it. So it is to protect industry within the.
Can I ask a question of both Rob and Christian, who know much more about this than I do? Has anyone proposed a CBAM that is graduated based on the country's per capita income? In other words, I mean, is that Rob?
That was kind of Waxman-Markey. It wasn't. There was a threshold, an income eligibility threshold. So really low income countries would have been exempted from what was effectively
I mean, a continuous thing rather than binary.
You know, why not? Well, and let us go back to the issue of loss and damages. Why not using a uniform CBAM? But redistributing some of the product, some of the revenue of the CBAM to the poor countries, that would be something I think that would go in the direction of what you propose, Michael. But with maintaining the quality of the price signals to everyone and the level playing field to competition in Europe. By the way, to full disclosure here, I'm a member of a committee that has been put in place in France under the patronage of Emmanuel Macron, who is willing to organize a meeting in June, trying to find a mechanism to fund the loss and damage that is requested by the low-income countries. So why not trying to putting in place a CBAM mechanism in the US and in Europe? Part of the revenue could be used to compensate the low-income countries for their loss and damages. Well,
let me say something.
Has anyone a proposal to try to solve this loss and damages issue, which will probably block the future COPs?
So 26 years ago, on the road to Kyoto, Brazil proposed something called a Clean Development Fund.
Yeah.
And the idea of this is it was basically going to be a $10 a ton penalty for every ton that a developed country missed its target under the Kyoto Protocol. It looked like to the US, it would be a UN green tax to send money to developing countries, which was just such a complete political non-starter. So that's why US negotiators started working with Brazilian negotiators to modify that into what became the Clean Development Mechanism. So I think the idea of designing some kind of tax instrument, which is already a little bit politically fraught, although if it's a tariff, if it's a tax that we think is being imposed on foreign entities, and we don't really think seriously in the political world about economic incidents, maybe you can get away with that. But then the idea that you carve out some of the revenues and send them to developing countries, I think that's politically really difficult in the United States. And I think Rob got to that when he talked about the prospects of US funding of loss and damage in his presentation.
But the European Union is perfectly free if they'd like to take some of this CBAM revenue that's forthcoming and contribute it to developing countries, either through a loss and damage fund or unilaterally outside of the UNFCCC, they can do it.
Well, I think that when Europeans will understand that the CBAM impose a loss on purchasing power on themselves rather than being paid by the producers in China, they will realize that maybe they need compensation for themselves rather than for the low-income countries. So But currently there is a possibility that the CBAM, part of the CBAM could be used for that. I think I don't see much alternative, by the way. And again, I say I agree with you, Rob. I mean, loss and damages is an issue. China will not pay, the US will not pay, and if Europe is not ready to do anything, the COP28 will be a failure, and probably the other COPs will also be problematic on this issue.
Yeah, let me say one thing that's positive about the CBAM.
Thank you very much.
And that is that I can actually validate from direct personal experience that there is a country in Europe, not one of the major countries, that is now seriously analyzing what kind of policies it needs to put in place domestically in order to escape CBAM payment. And that's the purpose, right? So, you know, you want the escape.
Okay, don't tell me which country. Okay, so I give you 2 minutes. Maybe is anyone among the panelists here willing to answer a specific question on the Q&A that I didn't cover, that we didn't cover in this debate over the last 20 minutes? Feel free to intervene at this stage. Otherwise, I will close the webinar. Okay, so thank you very much. We didn't cover everything, but it was a very large and encompassing set of topics. And I think that personally, I learned a lot from your discussion, dear panelists. Thank you very much again, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Christian. Take care.